Good morning, good afternoon, good evening guys, gals and gentlebuds, and welcome back to the shed. Right, so in the last video I'd done most of the porting work on the cylinder head. I won't say all because there's a bit of finishing detail to do, and there is going to be some more work to do on the head, which I'll detail very shortly. So this video, first of all, I'm just going to talk about compression ratio, and then we'll get on with lightening and balancing the conrods. So I'll reposition the camera and then we'll have a talk through some of the detail. Right, so this is a rough sketch of a cross section of a cylinder. So this would be the cylinder head, this is the block, that is the bore, that's the piston at top dead centre, that's the piston at bottom dead centre. So compression ratio is calculated as swept volume, which is the volume swept by the piston from bottom to top, plus clearance volume, which is made up of the combustion chamber in the head gasket volume, piston to deck clearance volume, and the ringland volume. So all of those added together create the clearance volume. Compression ratio is swept volume plus clearance volume divided by clearance volume. Pretty straightforward really. So I've measured all of these and done some calculations. So here we go. Right. So the combustion chamber volume I measured at 19.5 cc's. The head gasket volume, when it's compressed, I calculated at 4.28 cc. The piston to deck volume calculates at 0.0305 cc, and the ringland volume calculates at 0.337 cc. So the cross-sectional area of the bore is 34.368 centimetres squared, multiplied by the stroke, which is 8.382 centimetres, gives us a swept volume of 288.072 cc's, and the clearance volume, when you add those together, comes out at 25.21 cc's. 25.219 I think that is. So doing the calculation, compression ratio equals swept volume plus clearance volume divided by clearance volume gives me a compression ratio of 12.42, which is a bit on the high side. I'd be much happier with it to be around the 10. So the calculation suggests that a clearance volume of 30 cc would give me a 10.6 compression ratio, which is much more like it. So I'm going to have to add nearly 5 cc to the clearance volume. Now I can do that in the combustion chamber by removing some metal, or I could do it by skimming the piston down. I don't really want to skim the piston down because A, my lathe is not that good and I'm not a machinist, and I would hate to mess up an expensive set of pistons, and B, reducing the height of the top of the piston, while it will increase that volume, it also removes the squish area. Now the squish is caused by these areas. So if I lay the head gasket on top of that, so as the piston comes up to the cylinder head, this area and this area, the volume, the space between the piston and those areas gets very small, and it squishes the gas that's in those areas into the main combustion area, and that side being slightly bigger, it will push it towards the spark plug, which is where the ignition happens and the burn starts. So I don't want to take too much material out, because taking anything out of this area is also going to reduce the squish. But if we look at it, so there's material there that can come out, and there, which will also help to unshroud the inlet valve. There's material here that can come out, which will unshroud the exhaust valve. I need to be careful in that area. I'll get that gasket lined up better. So I need to be careful in this area, because that gap between cylinders 2 and 3 is very narrow, and if I make that too narrow, I run the risk of the head gasket blowing between the two. So that's what we'll be doing in a future video. We'll be removing some material from the combustion chambers. The surface to come away there, because you can see there's a step where the seats have been machined in, and there's a sharp ridge there, so all of that can be blended down. If that's taken down to the height of the top of the seats, will help. So it's going to be a question of grinding one out, popping the valves in, measuring the volume, see where we're at, take a bit more out if need be. It's going to be done in stages so that I end up with the right volume, and then once I've done one, I can repeat that process on the others. So that's the stages for that when we get to it. Now for the rest of this video, I'm going to be looking at lightening and balancing these rods. So as you may remember, I said in an earlier video that the rods from this engine were basically crap, so they went in the fuck it bucket. This is one of them, which I've had a practice at to remove metal, and that's come out quite nicely. So there's a lot more work than that to be done. There are scratches from the sanding belt, but they run that way. If ever you're doing a job like this, always grind down the length of the rod, don't grind across it, because every one of those scratches is potentially a stress raiser, and if they go across, it can cause the rod to crack and break under extreme circumstances. So when you're pushing up in the 6,000 RPM, maybe even higher bracket, any scratches across it are likely to cause it to break. So that was just a practice one. That's one of the scrap ones. These are the 4 I intend to use. So that's what's going to be the rest of this video, is going to be about lightening these and balancing them. And balancing them, A, involves making all 4 the same weight, but it also involves making sure that the big ends of all 4 are the same weight and the little ends are all the same weight, because obviously I could take much more metal off this end of one than the others, and then the 4 rods, while they would be, I could match them in weight outright, the reciprocating mass on the crank could be quite different on one rod or more, which would make it very likely to fail, and it would at the very least cause severe vibrations within the engine, which on a 3-bearing crank is not a good thing. We want to minimise vibrations. We want to minimise the reciprocating mass, which is the weight of that plus the piston that's going up and down in the cylinder. So that's it. I'll reposition and we'll get started. Wait one moment please. Right, so I've got my rod in the vise. I'm going to start by removing the boss around this oil hole. It's not necessary, and there's a forging ridge down the centre, so I'm using a finger file. I've got a vacuum cleaner set up to catch the dust because I don't want to breathe it, It's going to be noisy. One thing I forgot to do before I start, I ought to weigh the rods and see what they actually weigh. So, got a little digital scale. Need to get them so that their weight is all on the scale, not off touching anything else like that. So that is 668.4 grams. $671.2. $628. $665. Just try those others again. 671.3. 668.5. So they're not a million miles out. I shan't bother doing the one that I've started on. Right, get back to it. Going to be noisy. So that's the start of it. As you can see, remove metal, and any means of removing metal is going to lighten it. The purpose is to do it tidily without creating a bigger issue. Let's just see. I know I didn't weigh this particular rod, but I doubt if it's 664, so it might be a bit lighter. It's early days, I mean that's 5-10 minutes work. We've got the whole rest of the rod to go yet. This boss can come off, that's the oil spray hole, so if you can see inside just there, there's a hole. As the crank rotates, there's a hole in the bearing shell that lines up with that, and there's an oil hole in the crank that's feeding oil into the bearing, and as it comes round to there, it squirts a jet of oil up through that hole up to the underside of the piston. It's not going to make a lot of difference if I take that lump of iron off there, there's still going to be a hole. It will still squirt a jet of oil up. So that's the next bit. There's another 5 grams off it. So as you can see, that boss is now gone. We're starting to get a nice finish. I'm using quite a coarse belt on the finger sander at the moment, and once I've got the majority of the material off, I will then switch to progressively finer belts to clean up the surface. Getting into that is difficult because the finger is wider than the groove, so I may well leave that finish as it is and just clean around the edges. Right, I'll crack on with those, and it's going to be tedious, just like doing the cylinder head, but we'll get there in good time. So talk amongst yourselves and I'll see you in a little while. Right, there's a bit of a long drawn out affair getting all these rods lightened up and cleaned up, but I'm about there now. I've got them to a point where I'm happy enough with them. So rod number 1, 634.9 grams. Number 2, 634.9. Number 3, 634.9, and number 4, 634.7. so that's 0.2 of a gram lighter. I don't think that's going to make a big difference. Right, well, the other thing I wanted to do was balance the end for end. So in other words, I want that end of each of 4 rods to be as close to each other as I can, because if there's differences in that reciprocating mass, don't forget that's going round on the crank, anything up to 6,000 times a minute, which is knocking on a touch for an old thing like this. So I've got set up, I've got this nice big solid steel base to put the scales on, because I found that on the bench, which you might expect to be solid, it actually isn't, and I couldn't get a repeatable reading. So right, so what I'm doing is I'm going to support the little end on a hanging hook. And we're 497. .494, so we're within 3 grams, which I think is close enough. .495. .493 as near as damn it. So we're within a few grams. They could be better, but for the time it takes to remove weight from them, I think I'm going to be happy with that. Most important thing is all 4 of them are within a few tenths of a gram the same. You can see where I've cleaned it up. So I've removed the forging flash from either side of the H-beam or I-beam, whichever way you want to call it. And I've removed a lot of metal. I've removed the boss around the oil spray hole. There's a good few grams, and then just cleaned them up. And the important thing is, as I said earlier, the grinding needs to be done that way. If you go across, the minute grinding marks that you leave will cause stress raises, that's where the rod will break. It's just like if you've ever tried cutting glass, you score it with a scoring tool and then tap it and it breaks along the line. Hopefully that line is the stress raiser, and exactly the same thing happens with metals. So as you can see, I've cleaned all them up. I've removed mass from around the bolt holes that wasn't doing anything, clean them up, generally give them a nice semi-polished surface. They don't need to be super polished, but they do need to not have any stress raiser scores and scratches on them. Right, that's a wrap for this video. I don't think there's anything else I need to show you. It's just tedious work removing metal and grinding down and making a decent finish of it. So I think that's about it. The next video will be back on the cylinder head, which needs the combustion chambers opening up to increase the volume to get the compression ratio right. I think I need to add about 5 cc's to each of the combustion chambers to get the compression ratio around the 10:1 mark, which is where I want it. So stay tuned, keep your eyes peeled for the next one, hit the like, subscribe and notifications and all that jazz, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.